Judge Eleanor Hayes had presided over countless trials throughout her career. The courtroom had become a second home, a place where she had built her reputation on fairness, precision, and an unwavering commitment to justice. To her, every case was a matter of evidence, law, and facts, nothing personal. But the moment James Anderson was led into the courtroom, shackled at the wrists and ankles, everything changed. Eleanor sat at her elevated bench, her grip tightening on the gavel as she struggled to mask the shock coursing through her. The bailiff had just called the case, the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. It should have been another name on a long list of defendants she had seen over the years. But James wasn't just another defendant. He was someone from her past. A flood of memories surged through her mind. Summer afternoons racing down the dusty roads of Hammond, Louisiana, secret meetings under the magnolia tree in her backyard, whispered dreams of escaping their small town together. James had been more than just a friend. He had been family. And yet, as she looked at him now, there was barely a trace of the boy she had known. The man standing before her had changed. His once bright and defiant posture had faded into slumped shoulders. The years had carved deep lines into his face, and his once sharp eyes, full of mischief and warmth, now held a quiet weariness. The sight of him shackled, standing in the defendant's box, made something heavy settle in her chest. The clerk continued reading the charges: assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. A pit formed in Eleanor's stomach. Could this really be James? The same James who had once promised her they would never let the world pull them apart? The same James who had been the most fearless boy she had ever known? Eleanor swallowed hard and forced herself to maintain her usual authoritative demeanor. She had to remain impartial. That was her duty. It didn't matter what history she and James shared. What mattered now was the case at hand. She took a deep breath and addressed the defendant. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" The courtroom was silent, every eye trained on James. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Eleanor's heart pounded, though her face remained impassive. She had been trained for moments like this, to separate emotions from the law, to judge based on evidence and not on personal history. But this was James, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, that changed everything. As the prosecutor began presenting their opening statements, Eleanor barely heard them. Her mind was elsewhere, racing through all the questions she had buried for years. What had happened to James? How had their paths diverged so drastically? How had he ended up here, accused of something so serious? The weight of her responsibility had never felt heavier. She had a choice: to approach this as she had every other case, or to acknowledge the reality that this wasn't just any defendant. This was someone who had once meant the world to her. The courtroom bustled with movement, lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering, but for Eleanor, time felt frozen. She knew that in the coming days she would have to make the hardest decision of her career. Would she be able to uphold the law without betraying her past, or would her past betray her ability to uphold the law? For the first time in her career, Judge Eleanor Hayes felt uncertain, and that terrified her. As Judge Eleanor Hayes sat on the bench, struggling to reconcile the man in shackles before her with the boy she had once called her best friend, memories of their childhood flooded her mind. She and James Anderson had not always been on opposite sides of the courtroom. Once, long ago, they had been inseparable. Growing up in Hammond, Louisiana, Eleanor and James had lived in two very different worlds, separated not by distance, but by the invisible lines drawn by society. Her family lived in a modest home with a white picket fence, while James' home was at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields. The difference between them was never something they had spoken about, not at first. To them, friendship had come naturally. She could still remember the day they met. She had wandered too far from her backyard, finding herself near the creek where James was fishing. His fishing line had gotten tangled in the reeds, and without thinking, she had knelt down to help. It was a small moment, but one that would change both of their lives. That first meeting turned into many more. They spent summers racing bicycles down the dusty roads, making up secret handshakes, and talking about everything and nothing at all. James had always been full of ideas, dreams far too big for the small town they called home. "Eleanor," James had once asked, lying on his back in the tall grass beside her, staring up at the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Like, really leaving?" She had laughed then, brushing off the question. "Why would I want to leave?" But James hadn't been joking. Even as a child, he had seen the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their friendship had been innocent, but the world around them had been anything but. People whispered, adults cast them disapproving glances. Her parents had started to grow uneasy, warning her about spending too much time with James. Then, one day, it all ended. It had been the summer before high school, when her father caught them sitting together on the front porch, laughing about some silly joke only they understood. "Eleanor, get inside, now!" There was something different in her father's voice that night. Something colder, sharper. She had hesitated, looking at James, silently asking what to do, but he had already known how this would go. He had seen it coming long before she had. "Go on," James had said, his voice calm but heavy with something she couldn't quite name at the time. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again. Her father forbade her from speaking to James, and not long after, James's family moved away. Eleanor had thrown herself into her studies, determined to make something of herself. She went to law school, worked tirelessly, and climbed the ranks. She had built a career in justice, in fairness. Yet, sitting here now, looking at James in handcuffs, she wondered if she had failed him. What had happened to him after that night? Had he ever left Hammond? Had he ever been given the chance? And, more importantly, if she had fought harder for their friendship, would he even be here today? The thought sent a painful ache through her chest. As the trial pressed on, Eleanor knew that this was no longer just a legal case. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between the past and the present, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the answers it would bring. As the trial of James Anderson unfolded before her, Judge Eleanor Hayes felt an unfamiliar weight pressing down on her shoulders. She had presided over countless cases throughout her career, but never had she struggled to maintain her composure like she did now. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, was relentless in his argument, painting James as a violent criminal. Her control over criminals, he described the incident in harsh, unforgiving terms. James had allegedly assaulted a store clerk before robbing the register, making off with the cash before being caught just blocks away. Powell's voice was clinical, detached, as if James was just another name on a docket, another statistic in the system. Eleanor's grip tightened on the gavel in front of her. She had spent her life upholding the law, believing in its ability to deliver justice. But now, staring at James, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in a courtroom: doubt. James sat slouched at the defendant's table, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands clasped together. He barely looked up, but when he did, his expression was unreadable. Was he guilty? Or had he simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? The evidence presented against him was strong, but something about the case felt incomplete. Lisa Porter, James's defense attorney, stepped forward. Young but confident, she began her opening argument. "The prosecution will try to convince you that this case is clear-cut," she said, her voice unwavering. "But it is anything but. Mr. Anderson has consistently maintained his innocence, and we will show that the assumptions made on the night of his arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." Eleanor observed Lisa carefully, appreciating her poise. She saw in her the same determination she had once carried when she first stepped into a courtroom, eager to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. But even as Lisa spoke, Eleanor knew that fighting the system was never easy. The first witness, the store clerk who had been working the night of the robbery, took the stand. His testimony was clear. He had seen a man in a red hoodie enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then leap over the counter. But as Lisa began her cross-examination, cracks started to show. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the attacker was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" Lisa asked. "Yes," the clerk replied. "And did you see his face clearly?" A pause. "Not really, it was dark and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So, to be clear, you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" The witness shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but—" "No further questions." He said, Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his posture straightening just a little. A flicker of hope, perhaps. Then came the surveillance footage. The prosecution played a grainy, low-quality video from the store's security camera. It showed a figure moving quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing out of frame. Powell stood confidently. As you can see, this footage clearly shows the defendant in the act, but as Eleanor watched the video, she wasn't so sure. The lighting was poor, the figure was wearing a hoodie, but their face was impossible to make out. Lisa didn't miss the opportunity to cast doubt. Your Honor, we contest that this footage is inconclusive. There is no way to definitively prove that this is my client. Eleanor glanced toward the jury, watching their reactions. Some of them seemed skeptical, others seemed unsure. Then came the moment that deepened Eleanor's unease. James' alibi. Lisa presented it with careful precision. James had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery, but there was a problem. The friend was unwilling to testify. Mr. Anderson's friend fears retaliation from the community, Lisa explained, but fear does not equal guilt. Still, Eleanor could feel the room shift. A missing witness was a weakness. A missing witness could be the difference between freedom and a guilty verdict. As the trial adjourned for the day, Eleanor remained seated on the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. Her duty was to be impartial, to let the evidence, not emotion, guide her decisions. But was the evidence telling the full story? She looked at James as he was led away in shackles. His face remained unreadable, but Eleanor saw something deeper. Not fear, not anger, just exhaustion. For the first time in her career, she wondered if the system she had sworn to uphold was as fair as she had always believed, and worse. If she was about to play a part in failing the only true friend she had ever had. As the trial resumed the next day, the weight of uncertainty still hung in the air. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering, though her heart was anything but steady. The case against James Anderson was riddled with contradictions, yet the prosecution pressed forward with unwavering conviction. Was the truth buried beneath assumptions? Or was James really guilty? The defense, led by the determined Lisa Porter, was about to challenge the very foundation of the prosecution's argument. Their first key witness of the day was Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her fingers interlaced as she watched the proceedings with an intensity she rarely allowed herself. Lisa approached Officer Harris with controlled confidence. "Officer Harris," she began, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," Harris replied, his tone clipped and formal. "You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was found walking 2 blocks from the crime scene when you detained him. Is that correct?" Lisa paused for a brief moment before pressing further. "What led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris shifted in his seat. He matched the description. Black male, mid-40s, dark clothing. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Dark clothing? But the suspect in the surveillance footage was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession when you searched him?" Eleanor saw it before she heard it. The slight hesitation in Harris's breath, the tightening of his jaw. "No," he admitted, "but he could have discarded it." Lisa took a measured step closer. "Could have," she repeated, her voice carrying the weight of suspicion. "Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this discarded hoodie?" Harris's jaw clenched. "No, we didn't have time." Lisa turned toward the jury, letting the silence stretch. "So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description, without any physical evidence tying him to the scene?" The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Harris glanced toward the prosecution table as if searching for help. "I followed protocol," he muttered. Lisa didn't let up. "Protocol?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Is it standard protocol to assume guilt based on appearance rather than facts?" Then, the final blow. Lisa called a forensic analyst to the stand, a specialist who had reviewed the surveillance footage. His findings were damning. "Based on height and build alone," the analyst explained, "it is not possible to definitively say that Mr. Anderson is the man in the video. Even more shocking, The timestamp on the footage had been altered. The courtroom gasped. Eleanor's grip on her gavel tightened. An altered timestamp? If true, it meant the entire case against James was built on compromised evidence. Powell, the prosecutor, leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is speculation." "This is fact," the analyst cut him off. Eleanor stole a glance at James. For the first time since the trial began, his posture changed. He sat up straighter, his hands no longer clenched together. She knew what this moment meant. For the first time in a long time, James Anderson had hope. And Eleanor knew that before this was over, she would have to face a truth of her own. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of justice pressed down on Judge Eleanor Hayes like never before. She had spent her career believing in the fairness of the system, trusting that the law, when applied correctly, would always lead to the truth. But this case was different. This case was personal. Lisa Porter, the defense attorney, had done more than just present an argument. She had unraveled the very foundation of the prosecution's case. The arresting officer had admitted that James Anderson was taken into custody based solely on a vague description, without physical evidence. The forensic expert had exposed flaws in the surveillance footage, even revealing that the timestamp had been altered. The case that once seemed so open and shut was now riddled with doubt. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to a wrongful arrest, the prosecution pressed forward. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, community members, and curious onlookers. Everyone was waiting to see how it would end. The closing arguments would be the last chance to sway the jury. The prosecution went first. Richard Powell, the state's attorney, stood with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not as complicated as the defense wants you to believe," he began. "We have a crime, a victim, and a man found just blocks away from the scene." He gestured toward James. "Circumstantial evidence is still evidence, and we ask you to trust the facts that have been laid before you. James Anderson was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that is no coincidence." Eleanor watched as members of the jury shifted in their seats. Some seemed convinced, others uncertain, but one thing was clear: the confidence they once had in the prosecution's case was gone. Lisa stood next, her presence calm but commanding. "This case is not about convenience," she began. "It's about truth. And the truth is that the state has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that James Anderson committed this crime." She took a slow step toward the jury. "We heard from Officer Harris himself. No red hoodie was found. No physical evidence linked James to the crime. The prosecution relies on a grainy, altered video and a vague description to put a man behind bars for something he did not do." She paused, her voice softening. "You are not just deciding James Anderson's fate today. You are deciding whether we, as a society, accept assumptions as facts, whether we let bias replace real investigation." "Monsieur." Eleanor felt a chill pass through the room. Lisa's words were not just powerful, they were damning. And then, it was time. The jury was escorted out to deliberate. James sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. He had barely looked at Eleanor throughout the trial, but now, just for a moment, his eyes met hers. And she saw, not just the weight of this moment, but the years of struggle behind it. Hours passed. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs, whispered anxiously, and waited. Then, finally, the bailiff called the court to order. The jury had reached a verdict. The room fell into absolute silence as the forewoman stood. She held a slip of paper in her trembling hands. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant—" The pause was unbearable. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even cheers. Eleanor's gavel struck the bench, restoring order, but her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at James. His shoulders slumped, his breath escaping in a silent exhale. But he didn't celebrate. He didn't smile, because even though he was free, the cost had been far too high. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice steady. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." And just like that, it was over. Or so she thought. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered at the bench. She watched James sign his release papers, his chains finally removed. Then, to her surprise, he turned and walked toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, James broke the silence. "You knew, didn't you?" His voice was quiet but firm. "You knew who I was." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I couldn't say anything, James. If I had, it could have jeopardized everything." He studied her for a long moment before nodding, but there was something in his eyes, a sadness she couldn't erase. "You did what you had to do," he said finally. "I just wish the world worked the same for me." And with that, James Anderson walked out of the courtroom, a free man, but forever changed. As Judge Eleanor Hayes sat in her chambers after the trial, the weight of James Anderson's case lingered heavier than she expected. Justice had been served, at least in the way the system defined it. James was free. The jury had ruled in his favor. But why didn't it feel like a victory? Eleanor knew the answer. James should have never been in that courtroom to begin with. She stared at the empty courtroom beyond her office window, the echoes of the trial replaying in her mind, the gaps in the prosecution's case, the biased arrest, the surveillance footage that failed to clearly identify the suspect. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. James wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting against a system that had already decided his fate before the trial even began. Eleanor had spent years believing in the justice system. She had built her career on the idea that the law was fair and that the courtroom was the ultimate equalizer. But this case had forced her to question everything. She picked up James's case file, flipping through its thin pages. A few pieces of paper, that's all his life had been reduced to in the eyes of the law. A rap sheet with minor offenses, a vague police report, and circumstantial evidence had nearly cost him everything, and she couldn't ignore the patterns. How many others, like James, had stood before her bench, facing unfair odds simply because of where they were born, what they looked like, or the circumstances they couldn't control? How many of those men had not been as lucky as James? Her door opened, and her assistant, Margaret, stepped in cautiously. "Judge Hayes, you have a call from the press. They want a statement on the verdict." Eleanor exhaled. The media would frame this as an inspiring story, a man exonerated, a system proving its ability to correct mistakes. But that wasn't the truth, was it? The truth was that James had been forced to prove his innocence, rather than the state proving his guilt. And that was a failure of the system, not a success. She shook her head. No comment. Margaret hesitated. "Are you okay, Judge?" Eleanor met her assistant's gaze, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will be, but we have work to do." Margaret nodded and left, and Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with ideas. This couldn't just end here. Yes, James had been freed, but that didn't mean justice had truly been served. Eleanor knew she had to do more. The legal system needed more than fair verdicts. It needed change. It needed judges willing to question the status quo, attorneys willing to challenge the biases ingrained in investigations, and officers held accountable for the assumptions they made in the field. She thought back to James's final words to her. "You did what you had to do. I just wish the world worked the same for me." That statement haunted her, because he was right. James Anderson had been tried, judged, and nearly convicted, not because of solid evidence, but because of a society that was willing to believe he was guilty from the moment he was arrested. Eleanor picked up her pen and began writing. A proposal for reform, a plan to address racial bias in the courtroom, to require stronger evidence before cases were brought to trial, to hold law enforcement accountable for profiling. It was a small step, but it was a start. Because James's story couldn't just be another statistic, it had to be the beginning of something greater. As we grow older, we begin to see patterns in life, how opportunities, struggles, and injustices shape the world around us. The story of Judge Eleanor Hayes and James Anderson reminds us of something critical. Fairness is not automatic, and assumptions can be dangerous. Many of us were raised to believe in the integrity of systems, whether it be the law, workplaces, or even our communities. But experience teaches us that systems are only as fair as the people who uphold them. Justice should not be about power or perception, it should be about truth. However, too often, people are judged by their past, by their circumstances, or even by appearances rather than facts. This lesson extends beyond the courtroom. How many times in life have we judged someone too quickly? How often do we assume we know someone's story when, in reality, we've only seen a fraction of it? The case of James Anderson forces us to reflect. Do we listen with an open heart? Or do we allow past experiences and personal biases to cloud our judgment? For those in their later years, this lesson is even more profound. We have the wisdom of time, the ability to see beyond surface-level assumptions. Perhaps the greatest gift we can give to the next generation is not just advice, but a commitment to fairness in how we see and treat others. Whether it's a conversation with a neighbor, a moment of patience with a stranger, or even reconsidering old grudges, we have the power to create a ripple effect of understanding. The world needs more people willing to challenge the status quo. Justice is not just about laws, it's about the choices we make every day. And in those choices, we can build a world where fairness is not the exception, but the expectation.